It's hard to imagine that anyone could be so cruel as to deliberately target a child's wheelchair. But when you deal with someone like Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, cruelty becomes her weapon of choice. And that's exactly what led to the day everything came crashing down for her. So if you want to hear the shocking truth about how HOA Karen thought she was above the law, only to end up facing handcuffs because she had no idea about the ADA. Stay right here, and don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories because you won't want to miss how this twisted story unfolds. It all started when my family moved into what seemed like a quiet suburban neighborhood. We thought it was perfect because the streets were calm, the houses neat, and there was a park nearby where my son could get fresh air. My son David had been using a wheelchair since he was 4 after a medical condition left him without the use of his legs, but that had never stopped him from smiling or finding joy in life. And we had always been determined to give him as normal a childhood as possible. The first few weeks seemed fine, though we noticed Karen early on, standing at the corner with her clipboard and her permanent scowl, eyeing every new resident like she was inspecting troops. She was in her late 50s with tightly curled blonde hair and a sharp voice that could slice through steel. She introduced herself not with kindness but with rules. Rules about paint colors, trash cans, fences, lawn height, and where we could and couldn't park. At first we tried to just nod politely and not engage, but Karen had a way of pushing herself into everyone's business. One day while unloading groceries, she walked right up and said, "I hope you'll keep that wheelchair out of the common areas. We don't want things cluttering up the neighborhood." Her words made my wife freeze, and I stared at her in disbelief. Who talks about a child's wheelchair like it's some yard junk? I told her firmly it wasn't her concern, but she smirked like she had won some invisible battle and walked away. Little did I know, that was just the opening shot within days. Letters started appearing in our mailbox with the HOA letterhead, supposedly citing violations about the ramp we had installed on the front of our home. The ramp wasn't permanent. It was ADA compliant and necessary for David to even leave the house safely. But Karen had labeled it an unsightly addition. That required board approval. When we ignored her first notice, she escalated to threats of fines. My wife and I were stressed, but we refused to back down. We had the right to make our home accessible for our son. But Karen didn't see it that way. She saw it as defiance against her control, and she wasn't going to tolerate it. The turning point came one sunny Saturday when David was outside in the driveway drawing with chalk. His wheelchair parked next to him. My wife had gone inside to grab lemonade, and I was mowing the backyard, when suddenly I heard him crying, not just a whimper, but a heart-wrenching sob that made me sprint to the front. There stood Karen, her face twisted with anger, and the wheelchair tipped on its side, one wheel bent at a sick angle like it had been stomped or kicked. David sat on the ground, scraped from the fall, tears running down his cheeks as he pointed at her, stammering that she had shoved it over. My blood boiled. I rushed to pick him up and inspect the chair. The frame bent and one wheel cracked. It was beyond a simple repair. My son was trembling, terrified, and Karen just stood there, hands on her hips, saying, "Maybe you'll finally get that thing out of sight. It doesn't belong here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A grown woman attacking a child's mobility aid and acting like she was in the right. My wife came running and nearly collapsed when she saw the scene. She screamed at Karen, who just smirked and marched off as if she had proven a point. I immediately called the police, my hands shaking with rage as I explained that this wasn't just vandalism. This was an assault on my son's basic rights. When the officers arrived, Karen was already on her porch with her arms crossed like she had nothing to fear. She spun some story about the wheelchair being left in the way and her accidentally bumping it. But the damage told a different tale. The officers took statements, photographed the broken chair, and asked if we wanted to press charges. Of course we did. But what Karen hadn't realized was that her cruel act had crossed into federal territory. Destroying a child's wheelchair wasn't just vandalism. It was a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, something far bigger than any HOA rulebook she clung to. And when the officers mentioned this, her smug expression cracked for the first time. I could see the panic flicker in her eyes as she tried to argue. But the law was no longer on her side. What followed was the beginning of a storm Karen never saw coming, and as much as she tried to use her usual intimidation, this time she had picked the wrong target. Because this time, the entire justice system was watching. And there was no escape from the consequences she had brought on herself. The days that followed the incident with David's wheelchair were some of the most exhausting and emotionally draining my family had ever endured. Because while the police had taken our statement and warned Karen that this wasn't just a minor issue, she continued acting like nothing had happened. In fact, she doubled down as if she thought the whole neighborhood would rally behind her. She strutted around with her clipboard, stopping neighbors to complain about us, saying we were troublemakers and milking the sympathy card, and that our so-called wheelchair problem was ruining the appearance of the community. It was disgusting to hear. But what she didn't count on was that word of her cruelty was spreading just as fast in the opposite direction. People had seen David crying in the driveway, they had seen the broken wheelchair, and whispers of what she had done were starting to circulate among the families who had once been too afraid to cross her. Still, Karen was relentless. We received another letter from the HOA, this one stamped final notice, threatening us with fines of $200 a day if the ramp wasn't removed and the wheelchair wasn't stored out of sight. When I read that letter, my hands trembled with fury, because it wasn't just harassment anymore. It was targeted discrimination against my disabled child. My wife was in tears, worried that the HOA could somehow make good on its threats. But I assured her we had the law on our side this time. I made copies of every letter, every note Karen had left, even the times she had shouted insults across the street. I kept building a file of evidence. Meanwhile, I contacted the officer who had taken our report and asked what steps we could take next. He explained that vandalizing or intentionally damaging medical equipment like a wheelchair could be prosecuted as a criminal act, and that Karen's comments about keeping it out of sight could be tied to an ADA violation. The Americans with Disabilities Act is federal law, and interfering with accessibility is taken very seriously, especially when it comes to children. The officer suggested we also reach out to an ADA lawyer. So I did just that. I found a firm that specialized in disability rights, and within a week we were sitting in their office with our evidence spread out on the table. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca, listened carefully as we described Karen's harassment. When I showed her the broken wheelchair, she frowned deeply and said, "This is more than a civil issue. This is criminal. And it's a clear-cut ADA violation. She's in serious trouble." Hearing those words gave me the first real sense of relief since the nightmare began. Because for once, it wasn't just our voices against Karen's. We had the law itself backing. Rebecca helped us file formal complaints not just with the local police, but also with the Department of Justice, which oversees ADA enforcement. She drafted a letter to the HOA board demanding immediate action. When that letter went out, everything in the neighborhood shifted. Suddenly, Karen wasn't the one holding the clipboard anymore. Suddenly, she was the one under scrutiny. But she didn't take it lying down. One evening, while I was pulling weeds in the yard, Karen stormed over with Richard, the HOA treasurer, by her side, and they started screaming in my face. Karen accused me of lying, of trying to bring the government down on her, and Richard backed her up with threats about foreclosing on our home if we didn't comply with HOA rules. I calmly held up my phone, recording every word, and told them that threatening a family over a disabled child's rights would only dig their hole deeper. Karen lunged as if to slap the phone from my hand, but Richard pulled her back, muttering that we'd regret this. Then they stormed off, leaving me shaken, but more determined than ever. Later that night, neighbors came by to quietly express their support. A couple down the street told us they'd seen Karen kick the wheelchair themselves, but had been too afraid to speak up. Another mom admitted her son had been fined for drawing with sidewalk chalk, and she was sick of Karen's abuse. Little by little, Karen's iron grip on the neighborhood began to crack. Meanwhile, the police investigation moved forward. Officers came to take another statement from David, who bravely described what Karen had done despite his voice shaking. The broken wheelchair was logged as evidence, and Rebecca assured us that it would strengthen both the criminal and civil cases. Then came the moment Karen least expected. 2 weeks later, uniformed officers knocked on her door with a warrant. Half the neighborhood gathered to watch as Karen argued furiously, waving her arms and shrieking that it was all a mistake. But the officers were unmoved. They cuffed her on the spot for vandalism and harassment. And when one of them calmly told her that the ADA charges were being reviewed at the federal level, The color drained from her face. Richard shouted from the porch that it was illegal, that they couldn't take her, but the officers ignored him and escorted Karen into the back of a patrol car, her shrieks echoing down the street. It was the first time anyone had ever seen her powerless, and the sight was unforgettable. Some neighbors clapped quietly, others simply watched in stunned silence. My wife held David close as he whispered, "She can't hurt us anymore, right?" And I promised him she couldn't, at least not the same way. Though deep down, I knew Karen wasn't done yet. Her arrogance and obsession with control were too deeply rooted. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just a neighborhood squabble. Anymore, this was a federal matter, and Karen had no idea just how far the consequences of her actions were about to reach. Watching Karen get hauled off in handcuffs should have felt like the end of the nightmare. But in reality, it was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. Because while the neighborhood buzzed with gossip, and half the residents felt relief that someone had finally stood up to her, Karen was not the kind of person to quietly accept defeat, even from a jail cell. The very next morning, we received another letter in our mailbox, this time not on HOA letterhead, but handwritten in furious scrawl. Claiming we had ruined her life and that revenge would come, I turned it over to the police immediately, and they confirmed she must have had someone on the outside deliver it, because she was still being processed at the county jail. It was disturbing to think she still had allies willing to run her errands. Richard was the most obvious candidate, and his behavior in the following days made it clear he wasn't going to let this go either. He started walking up and down the street with his phone in hand, filming our house from every angle, muttering loud enough for us to hear about false accusations and lawsuits. But when neighbors confronted him, he would back off, just enough to avoid being cited. It was harassment by 1,000 cuts, and it kept us on edge still.
Oh.
Knowing Karen was behind bars even temporarily gave us a sense of security. Rebecca, our lawyer, explained that the case was gaining momentum because ADA violations involving children tend to draw strong attention. And the DOJ had already opened an inquiry. She told us Karen's actions could qualify as both a hate crime and an ADA civil rights violation, carrying potential fines in the tens of thousands as well as prison time. I couldn't believe that. A woman who had once bullied people over the height of their grass was now facing federal charges. But at the same time, it felt like justice for every family she had tormented over the years. Meanwhile, the HOA itself was imploding. With Karen absent and her reputation in tatters, homeowners started demanding transparency, asking where their dues had gone, and why so many violations had been issued over trivial things. Richard tried to chair an emergency meeting, but it devolved into shouting matches, with one elderly resident standing up and declaring, "This is no longer an HOA, this is a dictatorship," which earned applause from the room. I sat quietly in the back, watching the empire Karen had built crumble from the inside. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that she would return, because the legal process moves slowly, and people like Karen thrive on chaos. Sure enough, after just 5 days, she was released on bail. The sight of her strutting back into the neighborhood was surreal, as though nothing had happened. She even waved to a couple of her remaining supporters as if she were some kind of celebrity, but the whispers around her had changed. Now people crossed the street to avoid her, parents pulled their kids inside when she walked by, and the smugness in her smile looked brittle, like she was desperately clinging to control that was already gone. Then came the first of her desperate counterattacks. A stack of notices shoved into every mailbox, claiming that the HOA was suing us for defamation and property damage because we had supposedly lied about the wheelchair incident. Neighbors laughed openly at the absurdity. Some even tore the letters up in front of her, but Karen seemed unfazed. She continued storming around as though her word was law. And Richard began posting angry rants on the neighborhood Facebook group calling us liars and frauds. I kept my focus on the bigger picture, working with Rebecca to prepare for the hearings ahead. But things took another ugly turn when one evening we found our garage door spray-painted with the words, "Liar's House," in big black letters. The cameras caught 2 figures in hoodies, one of them moving with Karen's distinctive gait. But the police said the footage wasn't clear enough to make an arrest. Still, they added the vandalism to her growing list of offenses. And the file against her thickened. The stress was wearing on my family, though. David was jumpy, afraid every time he saw Karen in the street, and my wife struggled to sleep at night. Sometimes waking up at every sound, I tried to keep us grounded by reminding them that the law was on our side, but deep down I was carrying the same fear. One evening, Rebecca called with an update that gave me hope again. She said the DOJ had officially filed notice that they were investigating Karen for ADA violations, which meant it was no longer just a local or state matter. This was federal. Karen was about to learn that when you mess with a child's rights, the entire system comes down on you, and there's no HOA rulebook in the world that can shield you from that. In the weeks that followed, subpoenas went out. Neighbors were interviewed, and every one of Karen's letters, threats, and actions was documented in painstaking detail. Rebecca told me it was shaping up to be one of the strongest cases she had seen, and she believed Karen would not only face jail time, but also be personally liable for damages, possibly bankrupting her. Hearing that gave me the first real, deep breath I'd had in months. Still, Karen wasn't finished lashing out. She began trying to rally sympathy, showing up at people's doors crying that she was being unfairly targeted. Some slammed the door in her face. Others recorded her rants and posted them online, where they quickly went viral. Suddenly, the story wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore. It was on local news. The national outlets picked it up. HOA president accused of destroying disabled child's wheelchair faces. 8 charges. The headlines read, and Karen's name became synonymous with cruelty across the internet. Strangers left comments calling for justice. Disability advocates started showing up at hearings in support of our family. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing down on Karen with the force of something unstoppable. But even as her world collapsed, I knew one thing with certainty: Karen wasn't going to stop fighting until the very last shred of power was torn from her hands, and that fight was far from over. The media attention surrounding Karen's arrest turned the neighborhood into a circus, with news vans occasionally parked at the entrance, journalists trying to interview neighbors, and disability rights activists marching with signs demanding accountability. It was overwhelming, but in some ways it gave us a shield, because Karen's usual intimidation tactics lost their bite when the world was watching. Yet she still clung to her delusions of power, marching around like she was the victim, ranting to anyone who would listen about witch hunts and fabricated stories. What struck me most was her inability to show even the faintest shred of remorse. Not once did she acknowledge the damage she had done to David, who still asked me at bedtime why the mean lady hated him. His innocence made the whole thing harder. And I promised myself that no matter how messy this got, we would see it through to the end, so that he never had to feel unsafe in his own neighborhood again. Rebecca, our attorney, prepared us for the upcoming preliminary hearing, warning us that Karen's lawyer would likely go on the attack, painting us as attention seekers, but she reassured us that the facts were indisputable. The destroyed wheelchair, the threats, the vandalism, all of it created a mountain Karen couldn't climb. Still, I was anxious walking into the courthouse that day, surrounded by disability advocates holding signs reading "Justice for All" and "Ada rights are human rights." Karen arrived flanked by Richard and 2 other diehard supporters, her face twisted into a smug smile that didn't match the gravity of her situation. When the judge entered and proceedings began, her lawyer immediately tried to dismiss the ADA charges as overblown, claiming the wheelchair incident was an accident. But the prosecution countered by showing the photos of the shattered frame, the threatening notes, and testimony from witnesses who had seen Karen pushing the wheelchair into the street. The room fell silent as those details were laid out, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt on her face. But even then she whispered to Richard and shook her head like she couldn't believe this was happening. After the hearing, the judge refused to dismiss the charges and set a trial date, ordering Karen to avoid all contact with my family, but of course she didn't honor that. Within days, Richard was back on our street filming again, and an anonymous letter appeared in our mailbox calling us frauds and leeches. Rebecca assured us it would be added to the evidence pile, and the police advised us to keep our security cameras rolling at all times. It felt exhausting to live under constant surveillance, but there was no other choice. Meanwhile, the HOA board was collapsing. More than half the members resigned, and an emergency election was scheduled. Neighbors rallied together, determined to dismantle the toxic culture Karen had created. For the first time since moving in, I saw genuine unity, families working together to replace hostility with cooperation. One neighbor, Tom, even came over with his toolbox and helped us reinforce our gate just to make sure David could play in the yard safely. Those acts of kindness reminded me that the entire neighborhood wasn't poisoned, just manipulated by one power-hungry individual. As the trial date drew closer, Karen's public persona unraveled. Viral videos of her screaming at neighbors, the vandalism, and the ADA charges combined to paint her as a national villain. Reporters camped outside her house, capturing footage of her storming out to yell at them. Clips that only fueled the public's outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForDavid and #HOA Karen trended online. Disability advocacy groups pledged legal funds to ensure she faced the full extent of the law. It was surreal watching strangers fight for our family, but at the same time it lifted a weight off my shoulders, knowing we weren't alone. Then came a shocking twist. The DOJ filed a civil lawsuit against Karen personally and against the HOA as an entity for failing to curb her behavior. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one woman's cruelty. It was about systemic abuse of power. Rebecca explained that the HOA could be forced to pay significant damages, possibly even dissolve altogether if found negligent. Karen tried to spin it as a conspiracy, posting rants online about big government overreach. But it was clear her grip on reality was slipping. Richard's loyalty never wavered, though. He followed her around like a shadow, and I couldn't help but wonder what hold she had over him, whether it was fear, manipulation, or simply shared malice. The night before the trial, I found myself staring at David's new wheelchair. A gift from a local disability nonprofit that had heard his story, and I promised him again that we would win, not just for us, but for every family who had ever been targeted by someone like Karen. The next morning, the courthouse steps were packed, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Karen strutted in as if she were walking a red carpet. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was far less forgiving. Witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors recounting years of harassment, others testifying about the destroyed wheelchair, and experts explaining the gravity of ADA violations. Rebecca delivered a powerful closing argument, reminding the jury that this case wasn't just about property disputes. It was about dignity, about the right of a child to live without fear. When it was Karen's turn, she exploded, ranting about how we had set her up, calling the DOJ corrupt and accusing half the neighborhood of betrayal. The judge had to bang the gavel repeatedly to quiet her. The jurors watched with narrowed eyes, and I knew in that moment her arrogance had finally destroyed her as the trial adjourned for deliberation. The tension in the air was unbearable. Neighbors gathered in the hallway whispering anxiously. Activists held David's hand and told him he was brave. I sat there silently praying for justice, knowing the verdict that was about to come would change everything not just for us, but for Karen forever. When the jury filed back into the courtroom after only 3 hours of deliberation, the atmosphere was so tense you could hear every shuffle of shoes and every nervous cough. I held my wife's hand tightly while David sat between us, clutching the stuffed bear he always carried to court for comfort. The foreman stood and announced the verdict with clear, unwavering words: guilty on all counts. Karen's face twisted instantly, her smirk evaporating as the judge read out the consequences. Guilty of destruction of property, guilty of harassment, guilty of intentional violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and guilty of retaliatory intimidation against a protected class. The room erupted with gasps and murmurs. Some neighbors even applauded before being silenced by the judges. Gavel. I looked down at David, who whispered, "Does this mean she has to leave us alone now?" And for the first time in months, I could say, "Yes, buddy, she does," with certainty. Karen lashed out as deputies moved to escort her out, screaming that it wasn't fair, that we were liars, that everyone in the courtroom would regret betraying her, but her words no longer carried the venom they once had. They sounded pathetic, empty, like a balloon deflating. She was dragged out kicking at the floor while Richard sat in stunned silence, his loyalty shattered into disbelief. The judge ordered that Karen be remanded into custody until sentencing, which was scheduled for 30 days later. Becca leaned over and whispered that, based on the severity of the charges and her behavior, She was likely facing years in prison. When we walked out of the courthouse, the crowd of supporters erupted in cheers. Activists chanting David's name, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. But for me, the most important moment was simply kneeling down, hugging my son, and telling him he was safe. That night, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted. Neighbors gathered at our house with food and words of support, sharing their own stories of how Karen had bullied them. Fined them unfairly or threatened them, it became clear that we weren't the only victims. We were just the ones who had finally stood up. And by doing so, we had started a chain reaction that broke her hold over the entire community over the next few weeks as we waited for sentencing. The HOA scrambled to pick up the pieces. Richard tried to rally her old supporters, but found himself outnumbered. Many of them resigned or distanced themselves to avoid legal scrutiny. An interim board was elected, this time with genuine transparency, open meetings, and a commitment to fairness. It was strange watching the organization that had been weaponized against us slowly transform into something more neighborly.
Ow.
The damage Karen had done would take years to undo. David began to heal too, smiling more, playing in the yard without fear, and even going to school without asking if the mean lady would be waiting for him. But we never let our guard down completely, especially when we heard that Richard had been spotted late at night lurking near Karen's no-vacant house. He seemed lost without her, as if his identity had been swallowed by her control. Rebecca reassured us that his threats carried little weight without Karen backing him, and legally he was on thin ice already for his own harassment when sentencing. Day finally came. The courthouse was even more packed than before. Disability rights groups, neighbors, and reporters filled the room. The judge didn't mince words. Describing Karen's actions as a flagrant abuse of power, motivated by cruelty, and in direct violation of federal law, he sentenced her to 5 years in federal prison, plus restitution to our family for damages, legal costs, and the cost of the destroyed wheelchair. The gasp that went through the room was electric.
Oh.
Karen herself turned pale, her bravado collapsing entirely as reality set in. She begged for leniency, claimed she was misunderstood, but the judge cut her off, reminding her that not once during the entire trial had she expressed genuine remorse as deputies led her away. The image of her broken, screaming face was seared into everyone's memory. Richard slumped in his seat, his head in his hands. Knowing the reign of terror they had built together was over, the neighborhood was finally free. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a storm. Activists hugged us, reporters asked for statements, and David grinned shyly as people clapped for him. The relief was overwhelming, yet Rebecca reminded us that while Karen's personal consequences were settled, the civil lawsuit against the HOA as an entity was still moving forward, meaning the board would have to answer for allowing her abuse to fester unchecked for so long. In the following months, depositions were taken, audits conducted, and years of mismanagement uncovered. Funds had been misused, violations fabricated to line the HOA's pockets, and Karen had enriched herself in ways that shocked even the most cynical neighbors. The lawsuit resulted in a massive settlement, with the HOA forced to pay damages and restructure under state supervision. For once, justice didn't just target the ringleader, but also the system that had enabled her in the end. We not only secured safety for our son, but also set a precedent that HOAs couldn't operate as personal kingdoms free from accountability. Life slowly returned to normal after that, though normal felt different now. We had lived through something extraordinary, and David had become a quiet hero in the community, his bravery inspiring others. The wheelchair incident had started as a tragedy, but turned into a catalyst for real change. And while the scars would never fully disappear, neither would the strength we had gained, even as we celebrated. I couldn't help but feel a nagging thought in the back of my mind, because while Karen was locked away, her influence had been so toxic and so deeply ingrained in the neighborhood for so long that I wondered if her story was truly over, or if her absence would create a vacuum that others might try to fill. Still, for that moment, standing on our porch watching David laugh freely as he raced down the sidewalk, I allowed myself to believe in peace again. and to hold on to the fragile but powerful hope that justice had finally prevailed. The months that followed Karen's sentencing were like watching a wound slowly heal. The neighborhood gradually regained its sense of calm. But the lingering tension never completely vanished, because even though she was gone, her shadow still seemed to stretch across every street, every HOA rulebook, and every whispered conversation between neighbors. For a while things were quiet. The interim board tried to steer the HOA in a better direction, implementing fairer policies and organizing actual community events instead of just issuing fines. And for the first time we saw neighbors smiling at each other instead of glaring with suspicion. David grew more confident too, riding his wheelchair around with joy, often joined by other kids who used to avoid coming near our house out of fear of Karen's wrath. It felt like life was finally returning to something resembling normal, but there were still moments that reminded us the story wasn't over. One night we noticed a strange car parked at the end of the street with its lights off. When I approached it, it drove away quickly. The next morning we found footprints near our fence. Rebecca reassured us that Karen was locked away and couldn't touch us, but the thought of her remaining loyalists trying to stir trouble haunted me. Richard had become increasingly unstable since her imprisonment, drifting around the neighborhood like a ghost, muttering about conspiracies, and at one point plastering flyers on mailboxes claiming Karen was innocent and that she'd be released soon on appeal. Neighbors tore them down within hours, but it showed how deep his obsession ran. The HOA board eventually issued him a restraining order, barring him from meetings after he shouted threats. During a discussion about restructuring bylaws, I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on rebuilding our family's sense of safety. But one evening he confronted me directly on my driveway, eyes bloodshot, voice trembling as he hissed, "You think you've won? She's not finished, she'll be back." Before storming off into the night, I reported it immediately, and police warned him again. Yet he still lingered, like he couldn't function without Karen to follow. Meanwhile, media attention slowly waned. The story that once gripped national headlines became just another archived article, though disability advocacy groups continued to check in, reminding us we had sparked a broader conversation about HOAs and abuse of power. Several states even cited our case when drafting stricter oversight laws for homeowner associations, which was both humbling and surreal. David's story had moved people far beyond our small neighborhood. But for us, it was still a daily reality. We were grateful for the systemic changes, but what mattered most was the ability to walk outside without fear. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen, even from prison, might be trying to pull strings, and that paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Because about a year into her sentence, rumors started circulating that she was appealing her conviction, her lawyer claiming judicial bias and character assassination by the media. It was laughable, but hearing her name in connection to legal maneuvers made neighbors nervous. Some even asked me directly if I thought she'd ever come back. I told them the truth I didn't know, and that uncertainty was enough to keep everyone uneasy. The HOA board, now under new leadership, finally voted to permanently dissolve Karen's legacy policies, refunding unfair fines, and abolishing her appearance standards that had tormented families for years. It was cathartic watching her empire dismantled brick by brick, though it didn't erase the damage she had done. In quieter moments, I thought about how someone like her had gained so much power to begin with, how fear and intimidation had silenced good people for so long, and it made me determined never to let it happen again. Rebecca once said to me, "Karen's greatest weapon wasn't authority, it was compliance." People gave her power by not resisting. And those words stuck with me, becoming almost a mantra as I encouraged neighbors to speak up at meetings, to stay involved, to never let another tyrant rise. Yet despite all our efforts, Richard remained a constant reminder of the past. One evening, the police finally arrested him after he trespassed onto another family's lawn screaming about revenge for Karen. And though charges were minor, it was enough to make him vanish from the neighborhood for a while. His absence was a relief, but deep down, I wondered if he was just waiting, plotting, still clinging to the fantasy that she'd return as time went on. Karen's name became something of a cautionary tale, whispered among neighbors like a ghost story. New families who moved in heard pieces of the saga and shook their heads in disbelief that a homeowners association president could fall so far. But those of us who lived it knew it wasn't fiction. It was our reality, our scars, and in the quiet moments after tucking David into bed, I sometimes found myself replaying the sound of the gavel, the verdict. The image of her being dragged from the courtroom screaming, reminding myself that it was real, that justice had been done, yet even with her locked away, I couldn't help but wonder if 5 years would pass too quickly, and whether the day would come when we'd once again see her shadow on our street, walking as if she owned it, and if we'd be ready when that day came. 5 years can feel like a lifetime, or like the blink of an eye, and as Karen's prison sentence ticked closer to its end, a quiet unease rippled back through the neighborhood. Though we had rebuilt our lives and David had grown stronger, more confident, and far less afraid, the mention of her name still had the power to make hearts race. During those years of relative peace, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA became more transparent, neighbors trusted each other again, and families even organized block parties where kids laughed and played without fear of being scolded for trivialities. David thrived in this new environment, becoming something of a symbol of resilience. His story had inspired not only local families but also broader disability rights advocacy. And he had been invited to speak at schools about standing up to bullies, something that filled me with immense pride. Still, the specter of Karen lingered, especially when rumors began spreading that she had been well behaved in prison and might be released on probation early. Rebecca assured us that her record of violent outbursts during the trial would make that unlikely. But we had learned never to underestimate Karen's ability to slither her way back into people's lives. When the official notice came that she had indeed been denied early release, we celebrated quietly, but the countdown to her eventual freedom continued. Neighbors debated what would happen when she returned. Some insisted she'd leave town out of shame. Others worried she'd try to reclaim control. I stood in the middle, knowing Karen's pride would never allow her to disappear quietly. When the day finally came, we were ready, or as ready as we could be. Her house had long since been foreclosed to cover restitution, so she had nowhere in the neighborhood to return to. But that didn't stop her from trying. Reports came quickly that she was seen in the area, approaching former supporters, ranting about conspiracies and revenge. Though her influence was gone, her presence still unsettled people. One evening we found her standing at the edge of our street, staring at our home, her eyes filled with the same venom I remembered. It took everything in me to remain calm. I called the police, and she was quickly escorted away, warned to stay out of the neighborhood, but it was proof she hadn't changed. She still believed she had some claim over us, over this community. And that reality reignited fears that had lain dormant for years. Yet the difference this time was that we weren't alone anymore. Neighbors banded together, filing complaints, attending every HOA meeting, and promising that if she tried to worm her way back into power, they'd crush her attempts immediately. Karen's downfall had taught everyone a lesson about silence, about how quickly one person's unchecked cruelty could metastasize into systemic abuse. And no one was willing to let history repeat itself for our family. The years had forged us into something stronger, too. David no longer trembled at her name. He simply rolled his eyes and said, "She's just a bully who got caught," a statement so simple yet so true it cut through the fear like a knife. In those moments I realized that Karen hadn't won, no matter how loudly she screamed or how many times she threatened, because in the end, she had been reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. A bitter reminder of what happens when cruelty collides with justice. Life moved forward, and even though her shadow lingered, it no longer controlled us. The community thrived. The HOA became a real tool for good rather than oppression, and our family found peace in the knowledge that we had endured the worst and come out stronger. Looking back, I often thought about how a broken wheelchair had sparked an avalanche, how one act of cruelty had exposed years of abuse and toppled a tyrant. And it reminded me that sometimes the smallest cracks reveal the deepest rot. And that courage, even from a child, can spark change that ripples far beyond a single neighborhood. But even with justice served, I knew one truth lingered. People like Karen don't disappear. They fester, they wait, and they strike when least expected. And though we had won this battle, the war against people like her is one every community must be prepared to fight, because the Karens of the world thrive where silence lives, and the only way to stop them is to speak, to resist, and to stand together. And so as I watched David roll down the street laughing with his friends, stronger and braver than ever, I felt hope more powerful than fear. Hope that no matter who tried to rise again, this community had learned, and this family would never bow again, because justice had already proven it could prevail. And if needed, it would again. And if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, through the terror, the fight, the trial, and the aftermath, then I ask you one final thing: don't let stories like this fade. Don't let Karens go unchecked in your life or your neighborhood. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, in protecting the vulnerable, and in making sure bullies never win, then make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because together we'll keep shining a light on the battles that matter most.